We're going to talk a little bit about food sensory science. In a lot of food companies, people think this is just a matter of a couple of old ladies sitting in the kitchen, tasting a few foods and saying, that tastes nice, yes, so we put it on the market. Very simple. No, it's incredibly difficult, and it's full of a whole lot of horrible traps. So we hope we can show you some of those. All right, so a preference test. This should be, I've seen in textbooks, this is the easiest little sensory test you can do. So you say, taste the two foods. You may like them about the same, or you may like this one more, or you may like this one more. And simple. So what you do is just see which ones like the most, basically. But the data you've got is so many people like this, so many people like this, and so many people don't particularly care one way or the other. Then you make your business decision on that. Well, that looks simple, but something strange happened. A cigarette company sent out 2 cigarettes to people at home. They got about a couple of thousand people. And they asked them all sorts of questions about what did you think of the bite and the suckability and the flavor and the smokability, etc., etc., etc. And then at the end they said, okay, which one did you prefer? Did you like this one more? Did you like this one more? Or you don't particularly care one way or the other? And it turned out about 40% of the people said they preferred this one and 40% preferred that. And about 20% then said they didn't care one way or the other, which sounded reasonable, except the only problem was they were identical. So it means that here 80% of the people said they preferred one of the cigarettes when they were the same. So we've got 80% of the people now reacting to the testing situation rather than the foods or whatever it is that they're testing. Which means, can I trust them if I ever give them a couple of different things and say which one do you prefer? Are you going to tell me because you actually have a preference, or are you just reacting to the situation? We said this wasn't going to be simple. So this started a lot of research, in fact, and people started giving identical things to people, all sorts of foods and stuff like that, and seeing what the numbers were. These numbers didn't come up very much, and generally the number of people who say that they don't have a preference varies somewhere between about 20 to 35% of the people. But always the majority of people say they have a preference when they're identical. Well, this puts us back a little bit. What are we going to do about that? Well, the statisticians loved it because they could say, well, when they're identical, you can't really have a preference. So this is what you say when you don't have a preference. So what they could do is they could get their target pair of products and see what the observed frequencies were, how many preferred A, how many preferred B, and how many had no preference. Then they could give an identical pair, which they call the placebo pair, because it's a bit like a placebo in a drug testing. And this was the 2 identical ones. And they could say, okay, so if the frequencies here were different from the frequencies there, it did mean that here, that some people at least had a preference. Because here, no one has a preference whatsoever with these frequencies, but here, someone has a preference. So you could say, okay, if they're significantly different, there's a significant preference. You could use simple things like chi-squared. And so this got very sort of exciting. People would do this. They'd have a target pair and a placebo pair. And if the preferences for this one, and no preference here were the same as up here, they say, well, no one had a preference up here because it's the same as these. But if they were different, you could say, yes, there is a preference in there somewhere. But the problem is this. You may have about, 60% of the people here saying, I've got a preference when they haven't really got one. And those people are still making this judgment up here. So that means that the preference you've got here is, yes, these aren't the same numbers as here because of some people have preferences. But you've still got some people here just reacting to the situation, having what we could call false preferences. So we don't really know the strength of the preference for that food up there. So what we do? Well, we could just say, look, let's just get rid of the people who say they've got a preference here. Because they're not reacting to foods, we can't trust them, so let's just take the people who, say they don't have a preference. At least they're sort of being fairly sensible, in fact. And what we can say is that the reason that it seems that people have got a preference is there's something which we call a response bias. There's some feeling that when people go in there, this is a preference test, I've got to have a preference, so I will taste the things and I will give you a preference. Even though you're allowed to say no preference, no, I feel I should give a preference. It's a sort of bias that you have when you go in there. So What we really want to do is to say, okay, we're going to test people when we don't have that bias. The bias is switched off, not when the bias is switched on. And if you repeat people, you find that sometimes they have the bias, sometimes they don't have the bias. If they have the bias, we can't really trust them. But if they don't have the bias, we can trust them. And it's very simple to see whether they've got the bias, because when you give them identical things, if they say they've got a preference, then the bias is operating, don't test them. But when you give you identical things here and the bias isn't operating, they say, oh, no, I don't have a preference, then now test them. That's the time to do it. So that sounds good. The only problem is you only get about 20 to 30% of the people saying, I don't have a preference when you give them identical things, which means that for every 100 people that you test, you can only use about 30. So nobody's going to do that. What we would like to do is say, let's alter the test, because somehow people going into a preference test are just reacting and they feel they've got to behave in a certain way and give a preference when they don't really have a preference. So why don't we alter the conditions of the test? Why don't we sort of try and do something such that it isn't only about 30%, it's about 80 or 90% of the people say, well, I don't have a preference, they're the same. Can we change things? Why just accept that it's there? Let's do something about changing it. Well, what we need to do is start having to think about the brain. Why would the brain make you say you've got a preference when you shouldn't be saying you've got a preference, because the things taste the same? So, okay, what does the brain do? Well, it's a pretty busy thing, but we basically have smell, taste, touch, irritation, muscle feedback, temperature, vision, sound, all going into central processing and giving you an idea of the flavor of the food. We're not usually aware of all those things. If I'm having vanilla ice cream, I think, well, I've got vanilla ice cream flavor. As it gets warm, it turns into a liquid, and it may be more yellow or more white. It's only when you become a trained expert that you start noticing all these things here. But that's what happens. The only problem is the central processor here for all these, you can't, I mean, people will use all these as measurement instruments because it turns out that the human senses pick up things that your most sophisticated laboratory instrument doesn't. And so people will use the senses also as instruments for measuring food. The only trouble is they're not tied into a computer, which is programmed by Microsoft. They're tied into a computer which is basically developed for cavemen and cave women. So, if you can hear me, if you happen to be a caveman going through the jungle and you see a saber-toothed tiger against the background of trees, your brain, usefully, will enhance that. You'll see it as bigger than it really is, and you run like that. Your brother, who didn't have an enhanced saber-toothed tiger, just blunders into it. He gets eaten. I have kids. He doesn't, because he's dead. So we're descended from people with enhanced saber-toothed tigers, which is very useful if you happen to be in a prehistoric jungle. Doesn't happen much now, but it's useful should you be there. But on the other hand, if you were tasting a cake and your brain decided to enhance the texture over and above the flavor, now you're getting a distorted picture. So we've got to get in there and start seeing how things work. So part of what our lab does is to study the senses and how the brain processes information to see what it is that's happening in the head when you're doing these sensory tests. This is not a very popular area. There's maybe about 5 other outfits in the world bothering to do this. Most people doing sensory testing just use sensory tests on other people's projects. We don't. We want to see how things work. We would like to advance our science if we can. Okay, the brain, amazing. It's a very powerful computer. It's got about 100 billion cells. That's quite a bit. It's got about over 1 million miles of wiring inside there. Amazing how it all gets tucked into the head. It's got 1 million billion connections. It's only about 1.5 kilograms. It's about 1.5 liters. And it works on 10 watts. A fairly dim light bulb is 60 watts. This works on the amount of power that a small children's nightlight has. If we had an ordinary computer trying to do what this brain does, it would need something like 10 megawatts of power. This would power a small town. The heat generated would be so great it would melt the computer. Couldn't do it. To give you an idea what it does is this. When you look at something, the eye doesn't send a picture up to the brain. It just sends a list of features up to the brain. So, if anything out there happens to be, say, red, then these cells will fire. If it happens to be, say, a red horizontal line anywhere out there, these cells will fire. Vertical line, these ones. A vertical line moving in this direction, these ones will fire. A shorter vertical line, these ones will fire. Blue ones, these ones will fire. Yellow dots, these ones will fire. Yellow circle, these ones will fire. Brown line, these ones will fire. That is, every single little item of what you're looking at will make different cells in the back of the head fire. Somehow, that has to be scanned and turned into a picture. It's like an impossible jigsaw puzzle. To give you an idea of how difficult it is, if we take this hotel and we hang Christmas tree lights over the whole length of the hotel, all close with each other, some will be on, some will be off. But then extend that, take it all the way into Heathrow Airport, and then bring it all the way back again. Now imagine the number of Christmas tree lights you've got. And the brain instantly looks at those within no time at all and builds a picture. But not only that, they're not on and off, they're twinkling, because what you're looking at is moving. So the picture's changing. So this is an almost impossible amount of computation, you would imagine. The visual part of the brain is at the back here, called the occipital cortex. And the input going to there from the eyes is about 10 to 20%. The other 80 to 90% of the input to that part comes from the brain. That's doing the computing. And so this is an almost impossible amount of computing to do. If you've got about the largest dozen computers in the whole world and strung them together, they still couldn't do it. So the computer really is the most powerful computer on the planet. It's a bit slow at doing mathematics and statistics and stuff like that, but just for seeing, it's incredible. So what we're going to see is we got, well, some lights are on and some lights are off, so what were we looking at? And the computer just glances at it and said, oh, we were looking at one of those. So simple. So the computer is busy. It doesn't want to get overloaded with information. It's busy just getting us to see. So what it has is a lot of protective mechanisms to keep away redundant information. Information it doesn't need, because a lot more information goes up into that brain than comes into your consciousness. You can't cope with all the information. For instance, selective attention. Now, if I asked you, what did you see on your way to this room today? And I'm not letting you out to have lunch unless you've written down a good list of what you saw. You would all write something down. But if I asked you, what did you smell on your way here? Then a lot of you would miss lunch. Because I didn't smell anything. But if you went back and retraced your footsteps coming in here and just sniffed and concentrated on smell, you'd find there's a whole lot of smells that you didn't notice. We only attend to a very narrow amount of our input, in fact. That stops us getting overwhelmed with information, or the central processor. But there's a more subtle thing. The brain, if it's got redundant information, it attenuates or just turns down the input. For instance, I don't know how many of you have got into a big Japanese bath, which is very, very hot. You put your foot in the bath and it hurts. And so the foot politely tells the brain, hey, heat, heat, ow, heat, heat, heat. The brain says, thank you, you've got the information. Just tell me when something changes like this. Heat, 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 hot, hot. Shut up, I told you, I'm very busy going hot, hot, hot. Well, like you asked for it. And it just turns down the volume switch. Hot, hot, hot. If you move your foot, that's a new thing. Heat plus pressure. And boom, out. You go into a room and you notice, here. Well, the nose is telling the brain, smell, smell, smell. The brain says, yeah, I know, I've got your smell. Tell me when something changes. So you keep on saying, smell, smell, smell. And the brain says, look, I've got the message. Don't give me redundant information. So it just turns down the volume switch. And not forget, guess what? You don't smell anything. If you go out and come back in again, you'll smell it again. And that's new. So the brain reacts to change. It doesn't want redundant information. Well, we can demonstrate this. We could get you all to taste things, and you would find that things vanish and stuff like that. But another thing, in fact, you think of your saliva, it's chock full of chemicals. You've got salt in there, potassium chloride, all sorts of things. If you want to taste your saliva, get distilled water and keep rinsing your mouth out. Rinse, spit, rinse, spit, rinse, spit, rinse, spit. Do it. And after a bit, you'll think, my goodness, my mouth is bleeding. No, it's the saliva coming from the parotid gland. And now that your taste has got so sensitive because you've rinsed everything out of your mouth, you can actually start tasting your saliva. It tastes. But we don't need to taste it because we're not interested in your saliva. Your saliva does change during the day, but who cares? What we're interested in is sudden changes when we put something in the mouth. Now we taste that. So we can show this by giving you one or two sort of visual ideas, okay, some demonstrations. We have 3 vision or color systems, and they react to long, medium, and short wavelengths, but just to be simplified, we'll call them red, green, and blue systems. So when all those systems are firing equally, we see white light. So when we look at white, they all fire equally. If I'm looking at something red, this system fires. Something green, this one fires. Something blue, this one fires. If something sort of purple or this sort of color here, the blue and red system are firing, not the green. If I look at something greeny-blue, these 2 systems are firing, but not the red. If I'm looking at yellow, red and green are firing. Those 2, when they fire, give you yellow. This is not like mixing paints, where you get brown. We get yellow. In fact, brown is probably dark yellow, but we'll worry about that. Okay, so that's how the system works. So let's try an experiment, and let's try what we call sensory adaptation, or just turning down the volume switch on this stuff. Okay, now you have to be very disciplined here. What you have to do is to look at that dot. Don't look at me. Don't look at me. I'm great to look at. Gosh, what a fantastic person he is waving his arms. And now you're all looking at me. Don't. Look at this, okay? And you have to have constant conditions here. So keep your eye on this. Now, as you stare at this, the left-hand side of your field of vision is going to slowly get desensitized. The volume switch is being turned off. Slowly desensitized to red. On this side, you're going to be desensitized to blue and green. So keep looking at this dot. It has to be constant, so if you take a glance at me, then the image of this is going to move across your retina, the photosensitive part of your eye. It's moving, it's not constant, so this isn't going to work. It will be changing, so keep staring at this bit here. Okay, so on this side we're desensitizing to red, on this side blue and green. So when I show you white, then you're going to see white, but the red won't be working so well, so it'll start being dominated by blue and green. And when I show you white, the blue and green won't be working so well, so it'll be a bit dominated by red. It'll look slightly pink. So here we go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and colors. But they're not there. They're in your head. There's no color there at all. But it's just demonstrating to you again that, when you get redundant information, the brain just wants to turn down the volume switch to protect itself. Let's try another one. Okay. Stare at that. If you didn't get the effect, you weren't looking at the screen, you were looking at me. So behave yourself and do it properly. Right. Okay. On this side, you'll get desensitized, or adapted, as they say, to green. On this side, red and blue. So when I show you just a complete white screen, on this side, the green won't be working so well, so it'll look reddish-blue. And on this side, the red and blue won't be working so well, so it'll look rather more green. Okay? Keep your eyes looking at that. Don't look away. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. Color. This is telling us quite a lot about how the brain works, but after a bit you can't, resist playing around a bit. So let's play around a bit, okay? We've got a circle there, really, so stare at that circle. They say rain might be coming, so we're going to generate a rainbow. So look at that here and keep just staring at that. So eventually now, because the brain is desensitizing you to a whole range of colors now, you're going to see a rainbow. So when I show you just a white screen, you'll see a rainbow. It's quite persistent, and just to show that I'm not really cheating, when you see the rainbow on the screen, look at the wall, you'll see one there, or the ceiling, you'll see one there, or the piece of paper on you. Or even more interesting, look at your neighbor and they'll have a rainbow across their face. Okay, here we go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, rainbow. Now, have a look at people. Now look at your neighbor. You can see a rainbow on their face. Look at the ceiling. It's all over the place. Wherever you go, there's rainbows. There's ones on your hands. You'll see everywhere, in fact. Okay, I hope we all saw the rainbow. Rain may come. In California, we've had a drought for 4 years, so people are praying for rain. I went to California to escape the rain of England, but there we go. All right. Let's have a black and white photo. Boring, really, black and white photos. Let's make it a color photo. So we could do the same thing really here. Let's look at that dot there. Now what you have to do, this is very complicated. Keep staring at that dot. don't move your eyes, otherwise it's going to mess up completely, because this is a very fine, very accurate thing that we have to do. So keep staring at that dot, and slowly we're desensitizing you to certain colors, so what you're going to see is the colors that don't get desensitized. So just for an instant, that black and white photo will look like a color photo, just a short instant, if you have kept your eyes on that dot there. Here we go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, color photo. But it won't last long. It's not going to last long. Okay, so, I mean, it's fun, but actually what it's telling you is this is how the brain is working. It's basically protecting itself from information overload, and this is going to be important when we start talking about preference tests. So selective attention, not attending to everything, and also if you get redundant information, it just kind of switches it down to get it out of the way. But there's another thing is data reduction. If you're looking at, say, a red square like this, then logically it will stimulate all the red receptors on your retina, the photosensitive part at the back of your eye. And then they'll all send messages up to the brain, and the brain will say, what have we got? We've got, all those red ones firing there, therefore I must be looking at a red square. And it'll put a red square into your consciousness, whatever that is. But there's another way it could do it. It could actually say, okay, let's just project the edges and another message saying red. Now, with this information here, you can still create the red square. But it's much less information coming in than there. And remember, the brain is trying to protect itself from getting overloaded with input. And this is how the nervous system works. It's more efficient. And this is why phone companies like AT&T in America, they have laboratories in Chicago, and they're just telling their scientists, just play around with, look at these illusions and stuff like that. If anything useful comes up, let us know. Because if the phone companies could break the neural code, then they could transmit many more messages over far fewer wires, because it's much more efficient and cheaper. So what seems to happen here is as we go troubling along here, we come to, a red edge. We think, okay, then it must be red. It must be red in here until we come to the next red edge. We say, okay, no longer red, it'll be white. So it's the edges tell us what the color's going to be. All right, look at this. Here we've got a dark grey and a light grey box. Here we've got a dark grey and a light grey box. And here we've got a dark grey and a light grey box. No, we haven't. These are two exactly the same color. Don't look it, but they are. These are different colors, these are different colors, but these are the same color. And if you look very carefully, you can see there's a dark edge there, which makes the brain think, this must be darker. And you can see there's a very light edge there, which makes the brain think, this will be lighter. But if you don't want to be fooled, just hold your hand up so you can't see the edge, and then you'll see they're the same color. I would use your whole hand. Your finger may not do it, but hold up, and you can see if you cover up the whole thing. You see they're the same color. Are you all getting that? Mm-hmm. Why don't you go and sit in my seat? You can see more easily, in fact. I hate to deprive you of these children's games. I mean, really. Anyway, again, this is fun, but this is actually giving you a clue to how the brain works. And so you can find out a lot about how a thing works by seeing what it does. You don't actually have to cut it up and open it and see where all the wires go. So a neuroscientist, he sort of cuts it open and sort of figures out how a little bit of things do, how this particular cell works or something like that. But we can do what you call a systems analysis. Given all the cells work, I mean, how does the whole thing work in communion on its own? So that's what we have. So it seems that what happens is this. There's a stimulus out there. There's a receptor of some sort. We are talking about the eye. It could be a taste receptor, a smell receptor, a sound receptor, or whatever. It sends messages up to the brain, which is not necessarily a picture. It just sends enough attributes for the brain to build its own picture to put it in the consciousness. So we don't necessarily see what's out there. We see what the brain decides to tell us is out there. And that doesn't necessarily mean the same thing. And we know the brain's making a decision about what you're going to perceive because the decision can be changed. If you can change a decision, you're making a decision. So here's a simple little thing. Put your hands up out of interest as you see this as a picture of a young lady. Don't be shy. Put your hands up, yes. Please, put right up so you can see. Okay. Now put your hands up if you think it's a picture of an old lady. Yes, okay. Now put your hands up if you've seen this in a children's book somewhere before. Good. Oh, well, it's not many of you. Good. So we're still doing science. Okay. If you're seeing a young lady, what you're doing is this. This is her scarf. This is her fur coat. This is her hair, feather in her hair. As a young lady, she's looking like this. This is the side of her face, her jawbone. This is her ear, nose, eyelash, neck, little choker around her neck. There's the jaw. And you will see the young lady. Okay. Gentlemen, you take the young lady out for dinner. You take her home, and you meet her mother. Okay, here's the mother. Here's her eye. Here's her nose. Here's her mouth. Here's her chin. So you can see older lady now too. If you didn't see the young lady, sir, there's nothing wrong with your love life or anything like that. You tend to see the older lady because when you look at people, you look at them in the eye, and that's the most important thing. So if you look at that and think that's an eye, you'll build the old lady around that. I looked at this for a week and I couldn't see the young lady. I thought, there's something wrong with it. If you get to see the paintings by Salvador Dali, who was a completely crazy Spaniard, I think he still is, I think he's still alive, he does very good things like this. This is called Slave Market with Disappearing Bust of Voltaire. You've got a lady sitting here, there's some broken crockery, there's a ruined arch here, there's a few people standing, and in the distance you can see the slaves. And these are the people buying the slaves. Well, that's what it looks like, but if you look carefully, you can see a bust of François-Marie Voltaire, the French writer. So look again. And the archway, this is the top of Voltaire's head. Those are his eyes. There's his nose. There's his chin. And it's just resting on this pot here. Can you see it? Now, we don't have the ability here to make this blurred, because it's much clearer if it's blurred. So if you don't see it, screw up your eyes and blur it, in fact, and then you've got more chance of seeing. Those are his eyes, that's the top of his head, nose, mouth, chin, and that's what it's resting on. So again, same stimulus, but a different decisions made about what you're seeing. So we know decisions are being made. So they may be rather illusory. We may be seeing things that aren't there. For instance, here's a triangle. So that's a nice black triangle. And we've got a white triangle here. But in fact, there is no triangle there. It's just suggested to your brain by the fact that these lines are broken and there are little chips out of these circles. It's as though someone got a white piece of paper and stuck it on the board, like so. Well, fine. Two triangles. But now if you look very closely, you'll notice that it looks a bit brighter inside the triangle than outside the triangle. Can you see that? Well, it's not. The brain's just made it brighter inside than outside because it wants you to see it. It says there's a white triangle here, we should see that, so I'm going to touch it up. I'll touch up the picture a little bit so you can see it better. So it just makes it brighter. And the brain's doing that all the time. In fact, if I can get a cup. I'll do the demonstration with full of water. So I can get now. Okay, I've just drunk it now. Well, thank you. You should have spoken earlier, you know, you could stop me drowning. Anyway, there we are. There's the circle. If I hold it like that, it's an ellipse. You'll all see it's an ellipse, a squash circle. The ellipse that you perceive will be more circular than the actual ellipse. Because the brain knows it's a circle, so it's making the ellipse more circular for you. So you don't always see what's out there. So you've got to be careful if you're testing at all. Of course, you don't do silly things like say, oh, which of these two do you think is sweeter, this one or this one? But you try not to do anything like that. But let's say we were, testing an orange juice. Now here we've got our judge happily under white light testing the orange juice. They have exactly the same sweetness, but one is just a slightly darker color than the other, but they are equal sweetness. But the brain will say, oh, that's darker, therefore it should be riper, therefore it should be sweeter, and it will just make it taste sweeter. it'll put sweetness there, just as it put brightness in that triangle. So if you put it under red light, that may mask the color differences. So you have to be able to play tricks like that. And sometimes illusions, well, all sorts of strange things happen. See these two tabletops? Well, could you believe that the red one and the blue one there are the same surface area? Could you believe that? Maybe. Can you believe that they're exactly the same shape? Because they are. Shepherd's tabletops. We don't really know why that's happening, but it seems to be somehow that the brain, that master program in the brain, is confusing perspective and depth. And somehow it's getting confused and making the wrong hypothesis. And so it's saying, this is what we should be seeing, but it's telling us that, well, they're not the same, but they are. So, this one I like. This is called Kitaoka's waves. No one knows why on earth this is happening at all. No one has the foggiest notion. We see a checkerboard. We see vertical and horizontal straight lines. Now, if I add some dots, everything's going to go wiggly. It may not work for all of you. It does. It's a bit sensitive. It doesn't work if you're too far towards the side. But here we go. Now, things are going a bit wavy now. The lines are going wavy. But no one knows why. There are still mysteries in the brain that we just haven't solved. So, okay, what do we know? Just by playing around, we know that, well, the brain wants to protect itself from information overload. It's got ways of doing it. It recodes the information coming in. And also the brain just decides what it is you're going to perceive. The same with taste, the same with smell, the same with vision. So let's do a little systems analysis of the brain, because actually we're interested in preference testing. I mean, what we're trying to see is, why is it when you give two identical things, people say they've got a preference? And only about 20–30% of the people say, no, I don't have a preference. The rest all say, oh yeah, I prefer this one. So why is that happening? Well, what do we know? There's your central processor, in fact. This is what we call a systems analysis. So this is not going to be physiology. This is like an engineer looking at a machine and trying to see how it works. Okay, so input. We reduce the input because we don't want to overwhelm that central processing. But also, it has other little ways of getting shedding off information so it doesn't get overwhelmed. Certain things become automated with practice. So, for instance, tying a necktie, tying a shoelace, riding a bike, changing gear in a car. You know, what pedals do you push when? And we can do all those things without thinking about it. In fact, if you do think about it, if someone says, how do you tie a tie? You think, hang on, what do I do? You can't, it's sort of stuck in the subroutines. You can't get it back. And for goodness sake, don't concentrate on changing pedals when you're changing gear. It's total chaos you get, really. So it's been put in a subroutine. Again, this central processor is protecting itself from information overload. It started off with having to concentrate on these things, but now they're automated. They're out of the way. And those are motor subroutines. But we've also got cognitive subroutines. We automate thinking as well. Now, this is something that most of you will have because most of you seem to have English as your second language. Well, the first thing is retrieving the right word in a new language. Well, as you're actually thinking, what's the French for pen? Le pen, no, le pen, he's a politician. Whatever, and you sort of think and struggle. Then the word comes. Well, la plume de ma tante et non le bureau de mon oncle. Très bien, oui, oui. You have to do that, because when a wise person, wise cracks at you from the audience, you've got to come back with more. Just don't speak Greek or anything. I can't do that. So anyway, that's one thing that gets automated. And again, it's difficult. I think actually English is one of the most difficult languages to learn because we break the rules all the time. So if you're doing Spanish or German, they follow the rules. But no, we break them all the time. But that's a different story, why we do it. So that's one thing that we do then. You get automated. You just retrieve the word without thinking. It's automatic if you get enough practice. So that's automated. You don't have to do it with central processing and try and think about it. But there's another thing that you have as well, and which a man called Daniel Kahneman, he wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, and he got some Nobel Prize for this, in fact. He's a psychologist, but he pretended to be an economist because psychologists don't get Nobel Prizes, but economists do. Unfortunately, his partner, Tversky, is dead now, which is a shame. Anyway, what he did is he talked about fast thinking. There's, again, automated thinking. So let's look at an example of that. Okay, a farmer has 17 sheep, all but 9 die. How many are left? Well, we say 9 from 17, we say 8 are left. It takes 5 machines 5 minutes to make 5 Christmas puddings. How long does it take 100 of them to make 100 Christmas puddings? So 100 minutes then. The lake is a patch of lily pads. Every day it doubles in size. It takes 48 days to cover the whole lake. How long does it take to cover half the lake? Oh, well, half, 24. All those answers are wrong. And they're an example of fast thinking. That is sort of thinking on autopilot, not really thinking things through. If the farmer has 17 sheep, all but 9 die. How many are left? Well, 9 are left. All but 9 die, because 9 are left. But we automatically do this. Why? Because all through our educational mathematical life, we've been set problems where we have to subtract things. You hear 17 sheep, 9, okay, take 9 from 17, that gives the answer, because you've been doing that all the time. You've been answering a different question. If we have 17 sheep, if 9 die, how many are left? That's the question we're always asked, so that's what we do. We didn't hear all but 9 die. So what we're doing is answering a question similar to the one that's being answered, without actually paying enough attention. We're working just on autopilot, automatically. Again here, 100 minutes, no, 5 minutes. Each machine takes 5 minutes to make a Christmas pudding. So you've got 100 machines and 100 Christmas pudding. It's just going to take 5 minutes. But again, we see 5, 5, 5, 100, 100, 100, like that. Because that's the sort of questions we've had to answer all the time. In the lily pads, in fact, we think, oh, 48 days, so we want to do half the lake, it'll be half that, 24 days. No, 47 days. 47 days, then it doubles and covers the whole one, and then that's 48 days, in fact. So we do this quite often. We do this fast thinking. So now this might be a clue as to why we're saying we've got a preference when things are exactly the same. Fast thinking, it's instant reaction, working on autopilot, automatic responding, something that you've done a lot, so you just turn on that thing, not paying proper attention. Slow thinking, well, that's careful consideration, not just automatically answering, paying proper attention to the whole thing. So is the problem here automatic thinking, or just not paying enough attention to the task at hand? That is, we go in, we think, oh, preference test, right, taste these two things, I have a preference, I prefer this one. We're not really stopping and thinking, do we really have a preference? Because we stopped and we thought, these are the same, I don't have a preference. So, what are we doing here? Perhaps it is fast thinking, that we just go in and we have a feeling, okay, look, there's a preference test here, I should have a preference, so I'll give it to you. Despite the fact I can say I don't have a preference. No, here's a preference, I just go in and give you one. So what could be thinking is, what's happening is when I go into the preference test, you switch on your binary choice subroutine. That is, okay, I have two things, I must choose one. This will be the one I call my preference. And that has an inbuilt saying, have a preference. So it's just like that automatic fast thinking. So what do we want to do? What we'd like to do is get it out of here, back into central processing. So you actually say, okay, right, now we're paying attention. No, they're the same. I don't have a preference. So how would we do that? Because what happens when you go into this preference testing situation, boom, you switch on this automatically. How do I arrange that you don't switch it on? Well, one way would to be make it not look like a preference test. Make it look like something else. Then it won't switch this on automatically. So we use what we call a disruptive protocol. What we're going to do is not make the preference test look like a preference test, make it look like something different. So here's one. We call it a triadic preference test. All right, we have our placebo pair here and our other one here. It could be the different one here. So we're really saying, do you like this more than these, or do you like these more than this? So we say, okay, we're going to do a preference test to see how much you like. So I want you to taste these three things, and you have 4 possible answers. You may like 2 the same and 1 more. These must be the same and there's 1 more. These mustn't be the same ones, that's crazy. It has to be these 2 are the same and 1 more. That's okay, because you said, I like the placebo pair the same. Or you like these the same and this one less. That's fine, because with the placebo pair, you're saying, I don't have a preference. Or you say, I like them all the same. That's fine, because with the placebo pair, you don't have a preference. And your last result you can say is, I like them all differently. Aha, that's not fine, because you say you've got a preference here. So let's get rid of you. Now how many people do we have? Do we have only about 30% of the people not giving us false preferences? Well, what we are doing, in fact, is saying, okay, we're only going to taste the people that this response bias is not operative. Here, if it's operative, that is, you said that you had a preference with the placebo pair, all right, your response bias is operative in there, and we know, because you say you had a preference with the placebo pair, don't use those people. Just use the people who said no preference with the placebo pair. The bias isn't operative. So how many people do you get? Well, compared to your regular test, where you give a placebo and then you give your target pair, you may have 34% of the people say no preference. But if you do this new way, you get 92%. Now, this is feasible now, because you could say, well, just let's use the people who don't have a preference with the placebo pair. They're not reacting to the situation. They're now reacting to the food. So this is one way of getting around it. So now it's feasible. The food industry will say, oh, you must never in a preference test ever drop anybody. Gosh, my goodness, you've got to keep everybody in there, surely. No, not surely. If you've got people who aren't paying attention to the food properly, don't bother with them. You're trying to say, which of these foods do you prefer? So here's a way around it, just by not making it look like a preference test. There's another way. We can make it look like a preference test. And this is called the reverse hidden demand characteristics one. We disrupt the test again. Let the people have the placebo pair, and they also do the target pair. So we say, okay, taste these 2. Now you may like this one more, or you may like them about the same. And the person starts, and the experimenter says, we know you like them about the same because everybody does. Well, that's biasing them a bit, my goodness. And guess what they say? Yeah, I think I like them about the same. If they dare say, oh, no, I think I like that more than that, they say, well, were they very different? Well, no, not really. So, I mean, do you really have a preference? Well, I suppose not. Oh, good, right. And so then you can say, all right, so many people now, because we bludgeoned them, so many people say, I don't have a preference there, so you could only use those person on the target pair as well. So, how much you get here? What we're doing again now is we're not letting the person have response bias, we're just bludgeoning them down. If they show any response bias, no, get back down there, you can't have it, shut up. You know, we know they're the same, etc., etc. And now you get about, instead of 44%, 88%, feasible again. Now you may say, hang on, you've biased these people. I mean, you've told them that pretty well there's no preference. Well, actually, no, you haven't really. What you've done is they go in with a bias to say, hey, these are different. Therefore, I'm going to have a preference. All we've done is reverse the bias, so they say, oh, these are the same, so I don't have a preference. Now, if you taste these and say, oh, no, I don't have a preference here either, we're dead. I mean, all we've done is just bias them to say, oh, yes, they're the same, I don't have a preference. But no, that isn't what happens. After they said, I don't have a preference here, when they taste these 2, they say, oh, these are different. Yes, no, I think I like this one more. So what we've done, in 2 ways, we've disrupted the ordinary preference test. So it doesn't seem like an ordinary preference test anymore. And so now we've got people who don't have false preferences, because that subroutine of, oh, I go into a preference test, I must have a preference, whether they have one or not. We've got rid of them. So it shows that if you start studying how the brain processes information, and that's what we do, we study the senses, how do they work, how does the brain process information, can we improve the tests we've got? Because this is just one example, this is a simple test, but a lot of the sensory tests that are used are actual rubbish, actually, I hate to say. And because they were made up by someone called Bill about 30 years ago, he said, oh, I think this would be a good way of doing it. So he didn't test it to see whether it's a good way. He said, oh, I think it's a good way. And everyone said, yeah, why not? Bill gets promoted and his assistant takes over. He gets promoted, so his assistant takes over. He gets promoted, his assistant takes over. And soon, this way of doing the test is set in concrete in the company. It's in the rules. That's the way you've got to do the testing. But it wasn't a good test. They weren't measuring what they thought they were measuring. So the thing is, no one much is bothering to see whether the methods we're using in sensory science are any good. And there's not many people doing it, really. So it's quite fun to do because you actually find that, oh my goodness, this tests a lot of rubbish. But if you know something about it, you say, no, we'll test it this way, not that way. So our brief is to try and persuade the food industry to change some of their habits. They don't, but we say, well, do the test you've been using all the time. That's fine if you think it works. Not very good. But do this as well. It gives you extra information. And then when you die, your assistant can do the better test, basically. So that's the way it works. So, these are the people doing the experiment. These were the people doing the triadic one, and this is Yixuan Xia from China. When your name is Yixuan Xia like that, and I don't know if you noticed, but Putonghua or Mandarin Chinese, there's a lot of noises in there. So we just call it Sunshine, really, because it's nice. He's always very cheerful anyway, so there we go. So, at last, okay, we're now getting people to about 80 or 90% of our crop, of our sample, now say, I don't have a preference when the things are the same. So we're sort of getting rid of what we could call false preferences. So, be careful if you start doing sensory evaluation. It all looks terribly simple. People are just sitting and eating foods and stuff like that. It's not simple. It's more difficult than you think, in fact. So when you do it, try and do it with someone who knows what they're doing, in fact. You can get unpleasant surprises. You can get very unpleasant surprises sometimes when you're actually doing this. So don't get crushed. Find a good person who knows what they're doing and get them to help you. And cooperate with the brain. See, what does the brain do? And work with the brain, because so many of these tests work against the brain. So work with the brain. Cooperate with the brain. And cooperation pays dividends. Cooperation pays dividends. Cooperation pays dividends. And that's it. You can go and have your... Well, was another talk yet? Yes, sorry. Oh, you can't have your lunch yet. You have to have one more talk. Then you can eat. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Questions?
Oh, questions. Yes. Ask as many as you like, but the more questions you ask, remember, it means you have your lunch later. What? No questions? So, right, no, sorry.
We do have questions, yes.
And if you feel shy, I'll sort of be around a bit so you can ask it as well, quietly. Yes?
Hiya. Have you done a direct comparison between the old method and your method?
Yes.
And what was the result?
Yes, I mean, we did that there, we found. So we may have about 30% of people don't have false preferences with the old method, and the new method about 90%, in fact. So yeah, we always have to prepare. Yes, do it back and forth. Yep. Yes, la plume de ma tante.
Sensory testing still is it still used a lot? This is before new foods are launched onto the market. I mean, as in random groups of people actually called into, I don't know, Nestle or something.
Depends what you're trying to do. In some cases, you're trying to use the human senses as analytical instruments, and then you have to train people. So you might be testing ice cream. So you have to train the people to be as good at tasting ice cream as a wine taster is at tasting wine. It takes 12 years to get become a master of wine. So you want to be a bit patient on your training, because that will take time. But when people have done that, yes, they can be pretty amazing, in fact. But on the other hand, if you are testing consumers, you don't want to train them. You want to just keep them as consumers who are as familiar with the food as a normal consumer is familiar. Depending what you're doing, if you're trying to see if you've, say, reduced the salt content of a food, you've got probably two batches of consumers, some who just eat the food from time to time, and some who are regularly eating the food. They're going to be more sensitive. So you've got sort of two demographic groups. If you're asking people what people like or how much they like them or what they prefer, then you've got a lot of demographic groups, because different sorts of people. If you happen to be Korean, that's not too difficult. The Koreans are fairly uniform throughout Korea. So if you're going to Busan or Seoul, then probably you're going to get the same preferences. If you're in Japan, probably if you're in Tokyo, you've got in the Canton area, you have a Canton cuisine. And in the West, you have, I can't even name the cuisine, but anyway, it's different. The soy sauces are different in both places. So you've probably got two sorts of people. The United States is an absolute horror story. You've got Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, Mexican Americans, Chinese Americans, black Americans, white Americans, Swedish Americans, European Americans, African Americans, etc. It goes on. And they all had different mummies who all cooked different food. So that will have an effect, but exactly what the effect is, we're not sure. Because some people rebel against the food they were brought up with, and some just stick to the food as well. So that depends on your personality, which probably depends on whether your aunt beat you when you were young and all sorts of complicated things like. But it's a nightmare, totally.
There's a very interesting TV series, Eat the Story of Food. I don't know if you've ever seen it. Eat the Story of Food.
Eat the story of food.
Yeah, it was a very. And it sort of
Haven't seen it. Yes, no.
Eat the Story of Food.
Eat the Story of Food.
Talk about when Pepsi usually instead of beet sugar or something in the cola, in formula, and there was a big revolution.
Coca-Cola had this
People
problem.
wouldn't
Yes.
notice, but apparently they did, and it
Coca-Cola, I don't know quite what happened to Coca-Cola. One possibility is when you give people a test, a straight-off test like that, people will often like the sweeter thing, and they may have found that Pepsi was a bit sweeter than Coca-Cola, therefore they put more sugar in the Coca-Cola. But people who've had Coca-Cola all their life said, you've changed our Coca-Cola, and they were furious, in fact, because they could tell a very small difference, in fact, really.
Thank you.
And it depends. If you want to see whether people like it, let them take the stuff home and use it. That's better than just tasting it. I must get out of the way. Right.
Thank you. And
Oh, well, we see. Oh, my God.